Ethan Thompson had always been used to the spotlight. With his chiseled jawline, brooding eyes, and rugged charm, he was the kind of actor who could make a woman's heart race with just one glance. His career had skyrocketed ever since his breakout role in a series of high-octane action films. Fans followed his every move, and his face was plastered on billboards, TV screens, and magazine covers across the globe. Yet, in the midst of all this adoration, Ethan had become weary. The flashing cameras, the constant interviews, and the never-ending buzz of being a celebrity had begun to wear him down. He longed for simplicity, for a place where no one recognized him, where he could just blend in and be normal. That's when he found himself in the unlikeliest of places, Jerry's Grill and Chomp, a small, family-owned fast food joint tucked away on a quiet street corner in the heart of a suburban neighborhood. The sign was a bit old-fashioned, and the restaurant's exterior looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But Ethan was drawn to it for one reason: nobody here would know who he was. It was a dreary Tuesday afternoon, and the world outside seemed to match his mood. He pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang softly. The smell of sizzling burgers and crispy fries filled the air, immediately enveloping him in a comforting, if somewhat greasy, aroma. A few people sat at scattered tables, the hum of quiet conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of utensils. Ethan's eyes scanned the room for an empty booth, and he spotted one by the window. As he made his way to the booth, a young woman behind the counter waved at him with a friendly smile. "Hi. Welcome to Jerry's Grill and Chomp. What can I get for you today?" Ethan returned the smile, nodding politely. "I'll just have a cheeseburger and fries, please. Water on the side." The woman didn't seem particularly impressed by his appearance, which was a refreshing change. She scribbled his order down on her notepad and turned to the kitchen. Ethan took a seat, feeling the weight of his fame lift off his shoulders for the first time in ages. He was just another guy in a small restaurant, nothing more. But that peace didn't last long. Jerry Malone, the owner and manager of the establishment, emerged from the kitchen. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with a thick beard that made him look like someone who'd been through a few battles in life. He walked over to Ethan's table, his eyes scanning the restaurant. He looked like the type of person who might not have noticed if a celebrity sat down right next to him. "Cheeseburger and fries," Jerry said gruffly, setting the plate down in front of Ethan. He didn't make eye contact, didn't even pause for a second to acknowledge his customer's presence. It was as if he had been serving food his entire life and was too tired to care about anything else. Ethan stared at him, slightly taken aback. This was the kind of treatment he wasn't used to. Sure, he wasn't the one asking for special treatment, but he expected at least a little recognition. Jerry's indifference to his presence felt oddly unsettling. But instead of feeling irritated, Ethan felt something else: curiosity. How could Jerry not know who he was? How could someone in the service industry, running a place like this in a small town, not have heard of him? He watched as Jerry turned and walked back to the counter, muttering something about the fryer's temperature, completely oblivious to Ethan's inner turmoil. It didn't make sense. Ethan Thompson had been a household name for years. People had recognized him in the most random places: coffee shops, airports, even small-town diners. Yet here he was, sitting in a beat-up booth, feeling like just another face in the crowd. It was both liberating and infuriating at the same time. Ethan took a deep breath and, instead of letting his frustration take over, decided to test the waters. He picked up his burger and took a bite, savoring the juicy meat and the soft, toasted bun. He had to admit, the food was surprisingly good, better than he expected for a small place like this. As he chewed, he noticed a couple sitting across from him whispering and glancing his way. They weren't trying to be subtle about it, but their hushed voices made him feel like they weren't sure whether or not they should approach him. That was the problem with fame. People never knew how to act around you, always second-guessing whether they should ask for a selfie or leave you alone. Ethan glanced at the door. He was starting to feel the walls close in on him again. Maybe this wasn't the escape he'd hoped for. Maybe it was just another reminder that no matter where he went, people would always see him for who he was on the screen, not the person he was inside. Suddenly, there was a voice from behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Ethan turned around to find Jerry standing there, looking down at him with a neutral expression. There was no starstruck admiration in his eyes. No, "Oh my God, it's you," that Ethan had grown so accustomed to. Instead, Jerry's voice was flat, like he was calling a customer to pay their bill. "Can I get you anything else?" Jerry asked. Ethan blinked in surprise. "No, I'm good. Thanks." Jerry nodded and walked away, oblivious to Ethan's silent frustration. Ethan watched him for a moment, intrigued by how someone could be so oblivious to fame. It was almost refreshing. But still, Ethan couldn't help but feel a little off. Was Jerry really that uninterested, or was he pretending? And if he wasn't pretending, what did that say about the world Ethan had been living in for so long? As the hours passed and the restaurant slowly filled with more customers, Ethan found himself thinking about Jerry. What kind of man was he? How had he managed to avoid the fame-hungry world that Ethan had been trapped in for so long? But then, just as Ethan was about to pay his bill and leave, something unexpected happened. Jerry returned to his table, this time with a hesitant look in his eyes. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "You're Ethan Thompson, right?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Finally, he thought. But Jerry's next words completely caught him off guard. "I'm sorry, but I don't watch much TV or movies. Could you remind me what you do again?" Jerry asked, genuinely confused. Ethan froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The owner of the restaurant, the man who had been completely indifferent to him all afternoon, didn't even recognize him. For a moment, Ethan didn't know whether to laugh or feel insulted. It was like being in a movie where the famous actor was completely ignored by the townsfolk. But this was his life, and for the first time in years, it felt like the world had just turned on its head. And it would all start here. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan Thompson was used to the constant buzz of cameras and flashing lights. They had been his constant companions for over a decade now. From his first breakout role in a small indie film to starring in blockbuster franchises, Ethan had seen it all. He was the quintessential Hollywood heartthrob, the kind of actor whose face graced every magazine cover, whose name was known by everyone, except, apparently, Jerry Malone. Born in a small town in Nebraska, Ethan had grown up with dreams far bigger than his hometown. His family had never been wealthy, but they were comfortable. His father worked as a mechanic, fixing up cars at the local garage, while his mother ran a small bakery, making enough to put food on the table every night. They were a typical middle-class family, nothing extraordinary, but Ethan had always felt like he was meant for something more. As a teenager, he was the shy, awkward kid, always staying out of the limelight. He'd always been good at sports, especially basketball, but it wasn't until his high school drama teacher saw something special in him that his life began to change. Mrs. Jenkins had convinced Ethan to audition for the lead role in the school play, even though he had zero interest in acting. He was a kid who'd rather shoot hoops or play video games than stand on stage in front of an audience. But when Ethan stepped on that stage for the first time, something clicked. The lights, the audience, the rush of adrenaline, it felt right. He delivered his lines with an intensity that surprised even himself, and when the final curtain came down, the applause felt like a dream. That night, Ethan realized that he had something more than just athletic talent. He had a natural ability to captivate an audience, and it was a gift he could no longer ignore. After high school, Ethan moved to Los Angeles, hoping to find his way into the acting world. It wasn't easy. He spent months auditioning for minor roles, taking whatever he could get just to keep the dream alive. His first real break came when he was cast as the supporting character in a crime drama series. While the show wasn't an immediate hit, it gave Ethan the exposure he needed, and soon, he was landing more and more roles. His breakthrough role came when he was cast in the action film Chase the Storm, a high-budget thriller about a daring group of storm chasers who risk their lives to study violent weather patterns. Ethan played the charming yet troubled lead character, and the film was a massive success. From that point on, Ethan's career skyrocketed. He was offered roles left and right, becoming the go-to actor for action-packed films. But with fame came a price. Ethan quickly discovered the ugly side of stardom. Paparazzi stalked him relentlessly, reporting every detail of his life, from his relationships to his meals. The tabloids painted him as a heartbreaker, constantly in and out of high-profile relationships with beautiful actresses. But the truth was, Ethan was never really happy in these relationships. They were just distractions, temporary fixes for the emptiness he felt inside. As the years passed, Ethan's sense of self began to erode. What started as a dream, acting in front of millions, being adored by fans, began to feel like a prison. He hated the public persona he'd created, the expectations that came with being Ethan Thompson, the action star. He longed for a life where he wasn't constantly scrutinized, where he could just be himself. His last few films had been huge hits, but they had only deepened his dissatisfaction. The rise of the Titans franchise had brought in millions at the box office, but the fame and success left him feeling hollow. He had millions of fans, but few real friends. No one really knew him anymore, at least, not the real him. The person who loved quiet mornings, reading books by the fire, or going for long walks without anyone recognizing him. That's why he'd taken the decision to go off the grid for a while. To step away from the limelight and disappear into the crowd. He wanted to experience life as a regular person again. That's when he found Jerry's Grill and Chomp, the little fast food joint in the heart of the city that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The moment Ethan walked in, he knew he'd found a place where no one would know who he was. Ethan had hoped that Jerry, the owner of the restaurant, would give him a taste of normalcy. The anonymity he longed for. But Jerry's indifference was not something Ethan had anticipated. Most people who recognized him were eager to make a connection, even if it was just for a quick selfie. Jerry, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to his fame, which, at first, irritated Ethan. But there was something else too. Something that tugged at him. Jerry's simple, unpretentious life had a certain appeal. Jerry didn't seem to care about status or fame. He wasn't interested in taking advantage of Ethan's celebrity for his own gain, and that intrigued Ethan even more. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, he could connect with someone who wasn't interested in the version of him that everyone else saw, the one that lived on movie posters and magazine covers. Ethan's mind wandered as he sat there, picking at his fries and contemplating the strange encounter. His thoughts were interrupted when he overheard the same couple from earlier talking. They were still whispering, but this time their conversation was louder, and their curiosity more apparent. Isn't that the guy from the movie, Chase the Storm?" one of them asked in a hushed tone. "Yeah, I think it is. But, he's not acting like himself, you know. He doesn't even seem to care that no one recognizes him," the other person replied. Ethan listened closely, but he didn't want to engage. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace in hearing their words. He didn't need to be the famous Ethan Thompson anymore. He was just Ethan, sitting in a fast food joint, eating a cheeseburger and fries. And maybe, for the first time in years, that was enough. The days following Ethan's unexpected encounter at Jerry's Grill and Chomp were an odd mixture of calm and confusion. On the one hand, Ethan felt a sense of relief. For the first time in ages, he could walk into a place without being bombarded by a swarm of paparazzi or having every move scrutinized. For the first time in ages, he could breathe without a camera shoved in his face. But on the other hand, something about Jerry's indifference continued to gnaw at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jerry's lack of recognition didn't bother him the way it should have, it fascinated him. Why didn't Jerry care? What kind of person lived in a world so detached from the one Ethan was trapped in? The more he thought about it, the more Ethan realized just how desperate he was for something real. Something raw. So, he went back. It was a Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the city. Ethan drove the familiar route back to Jerry's Grill and Chomp, his thoughts racing. He didn't even know what he was looking for, but there was something about the restaurant that kept drawing him back. Maybe it was the simplicity of the food or the way the world seemed to slow down inside its worn walls. Or maybe it was the fact that Jerry didn't seem to give a damn about his fame. When he walked through the door, the bell chimed above him, and once again, the comforting smell of burgers and fries filled the air. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, and just as before, Jerry was behind the counter, serving food and chatting with customers as if there wasn't a care in the world. The same indifferent attitude, the same gruff demeanor. Ethan stepped up to the counter, trying to shake off the nerves that had crept into his chest. "Hey, Jerry," he greeted, his voice casual, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his tone. "How's it going?" Jerry looked up from the fryer, his face unreadable. He didn't give any outward sign of recognition, but that wasn't surprising. Ethan wasn't expecting anything special. "Hey," Jerry said simply, as if he were addressing any other customer. "What can I get you?" Ethan paused for a moment, then shrugged. "The usual. Cheeseburger and fries." Jerry jotted it down without a second glance and returned to preparing the order. Ethan couldn't help but notice how focused Jerry was, how he seemed completely unaffected by the world around him. It was as if he was in his own little bubble, disconnected from everything else. Ethan sat down in the same booth he had last time, near the window. He tried to keep his mind occupied, but it wasn't easy. The tension in the air felt thick, almost palpable. There was something about Jerry's cool detachment that was unsettling, something about it that was different from all the others who fawned over him. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he was determined to find out. His thoughts were interrupted and a voice called out from across the room. "Hey, Ethan. You're back." Ethan turned to see the couple from before, the ones who had been whispering earlier. They were sitting in the corner booth now, waving enthusiastically. Ethan managed a smile, though it felt forced. The last thing he wanted was to be recognized. But there was something about the couple's friendly demeanor that made him feel strangely welcomed. "Yeah," Ethan said, walking over to their table. "I'm back. How's it going?" The woman, who had short blonde hair and a wide smile, grinned as she waved him in. "Good to see you again. We were just talking about your movies the other day. We love Chase the Storm. My husband is a huge fan of your work." Her husband, a tall man with a thick beard, smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, I mean, I'm not normally the type to fanboy, but, you're pretty cool." Ethan chuckled softly, trying to ease the awkwardness. "Thanks, I appreciate that." As they continued to chat, Ethan found himself growing more and more uncomfortable. It wasn't that the couple was rude, they were warm, friendly, and genuinely seemed to enjoy his company, but it reminded him of everything he was trying to escape. The constant recognition. The need to be on. The pressure of being a role model or a superstar. In that moment, he realized just how much he hated the expectations that came with fame. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to be Ethan. "I'll let you guys finish your meal," Ethan said after a few minutes. "I need to grab something to drink anyway." The couple waved him off, still smiling. As Ethan stood up and walked to the counter, he found himself standing next to Jerry again. For a moment, they locked eyes, and Jerry gave him a small nod. "Everything okay?" Jerry asked, his voice devoid of any interest in celebrity gossip. It was the kind of question you'd ask a friend, not a customer. Ethan couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, as though Jerry was the only person in this whole place who wasn't trying to get something from him. "Yeah, I'm fine," Ethan said, trying to keep things light. "Just taking a breather. You know how it is." Jerry grunted in acknowledgement but didn't offer much more. Ethan felt a pang of frustration. Why was Jerry so indifferent? Why was this man, who had no reason to care about him, so different from everyone else? The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized how much he envied Jerry's straightforwardness. In a world full of empty interactions and fake smiles, Jerry was the one person who wasn't playing a game. Ethan took his drink and returned to his booth, his mind spinning. There was something about Jerry, something that rubbed Ethan the wrong way, but at the same time, it felt like the one thing he'd been searching for, honesty. The more he sat there, the more he realized that Jerry was everything he wasn't: simple, grounded, and detached from the shallow world of Hollywood. And it wasn't just his attitude that bothered Ethan, it was the growing feeling that he could never truly be himself again, not as long as people expected him to be the perfect actor, the perfect star. But as the restaurant started to empty and the noise died down, a strange thought began to form in Ethan's mind. Maybe it wasn't just Jerry who was indifferent to fame. Maybe, in the end, it was Ethan who needed to shed his own expectations, the ones he had placed on himself as a star. And maybe, just maybe, Jerry was the key to him figuring that out. The following week, Ethan couldn't shake the thoughts of Jerry and his restaurant. Every time he tried to focus on something else, his mind kept drifting back to Jerry's grill and chomp. He found himself there more often now, sneaking in under the guise of wanting a quiet meal. But it wasn't just the food that called to him. It was Jerry. The way Jerry moved, the way he ran his business with such ease and without pretension. There was something about that simple life that tugged at Ethan's heart. This time, when Ethan entered, Jerry wasn't behind the counter. Instead, a young man with shaggy hair was taking orders. The restaurant was quieter than usual, with only a few patrons scattered around, but Ethan couldn't help but notice the absence of Jerry. He approached the counter, trying to make himself scarce. "Hey, is Jerry around today?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The young man behind the counter smiled and nodded. "Yeah, he's in the back. Been there most of the day." "You looking for him?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then he made up his mind. "Yeah. I just wanted to talk to him for a minute." The young man shrugged, unaware of Ethan's inner turmoil. "Sure. I'll let him know you're here." As Ethan made his way toward the back of the restaurant, his nerves tingled. For some reason, he felt like this wasn't just another ordinary visit. Something had shifted. It wasn't just that he wanted Jerry's company, it was something deeper, something he couldn't fully understand yet. But he was about to find out. When he entered the back area, he found Jerry sitting at a small table, a clipboard in front of him as he scribbled something down. It was a surprisingly mundane sight. Jerry looked up and raised an eyebrow, as if surprised to see Ethan standing there. "Didn't think I'd see you back so soon," Jerry said, his tone still indifferent, but there was a slight twinkle of curiosity in his eyes. Ethan sat down across from him, trying to be as nonchalant as possible. "I know. But I was thinking. I'd like to talk. About life, I guess." Jerry didn't respond immediately. He just set the clipboard down and leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan for a moment. "Life? What's there to talk about? It's all the same. Get up, go to work, serve food. Go home. Try to get some sleep." Ethan chuckled, though it was tinged with something deeper. "Sounds like the exact opposite of what I'm used to." Jerry raised an eyebrow again. "I figured as much. I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's trying to escape something. Hollywood isn't exactly a place for peace of mind." Ethan stared at him for a beat, surprised by the directness of Jerry's words. It was rare for anyone to speak to him that honestly. "Yeah, that's exactly it. I don't know how I ended up here. One minute, I'm the star of Chase the Storm, the next minute, I'm sitting here, trying to figure out how to live a normal life. You think sitting here will give you that? Jerry asked, leaning forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. This place isn't a magic pill, you know. It's just a restaurant. I know. But I feel like. I don't know. It's the only place I've found where I can breathe. Where people don't expect me to be someone. Just, me. Jerry leaned back again, his arms crossed. You think you can get away from who you are just by sitting in a booth and ordering a burger? It doesn't work that way. Ethan felt a flicker of frustration, but he tamped it down. I'm not trying to escape. I just want to be normal again. I want to remember what it felt like to not be constantly under a microscope, to just live without pretending. Pretending? Jerry scoffed. The whole world's pretending. It's not just you. You think you're the only one who's tired of being watched? Hell, I've been in this game long enough to know that no one's really living their life. You think I'm here because I want to be? I'm here because I've got bills to pay, mouths to feed, and a family I'm trying to take care of. That's real life. And if you think being a big-time movie star is gonna solve all your problems, you've got another thing coming. Ethan felt a pang of anger rise in his chest, but he held it back. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Most people were in awe of him, eager to flatter him or gain something from him. But Jerry was different. And in a strange way, that made him feel more alive than he had in a long time. You're right, Ethan said, his voice low. I didn't come here looking for answers. I just came because I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. There was silence between them for a moment. Jerry didn't speak, but the weight of his presence seemed to fill the space. Finally, he broke the silence. Well, Ethan, Jerry said, his voice softer now, maybe you've got to stop looking for answers and start living. You can't fix everything by running away. You have to face it, one day at a time. That's how it works. Ethan sat back in his chair, contemplating Jerry's words. He wasn't sure if they were exactly what he wanted to hear, but they felt real. They felt like the kind of advice someone would give to a friend, not a celebrity. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt like he might just be ready to face whatever came next. Before he could respond, the door to the back opened, and the young man from the front appeared with a tray of food. Orders ready for you, Jerry. I'll put it on the counter. Ethan stood up and nodded to Jerry. Thanks for talking to me. I didn't expect any of that. Jerry shrugged, grabbing the clipboard again. Like I said, life's not about expecting anything. It's about dealing with what comes your way. As Ethan left the back room and made his way toward the exit, he felt something shift within him. The weight of his fame, the constant pressure, was still there. But Jerry's words had planted a seed in his mind. Maybe it wasn't about finding normalcy or escaping the spotlight. Maybe it was about finding peace in the chaos. And as he walked out into the bustling streets, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change everything. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. The next few days were a blur for Ethan. What Jerry had said echoed in his mind like a broken record, each word slowly carving its way through the layers of confusion that had built up around his life. You can't fix everything by running away. You have to face it, one day at a time. It was simple, almost too simple to make sense of at first. But as the days passed, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, Jerry had been right all along. He was exhausted from the constant cycle of press tours, red carpet events, and interviews. The fake smiles, the questions that circled around his career instead of who he really was, it all felt like an act now. He had spent years playing a character in front of the camera, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how to be himself when the cameras weren't rolling. It was early morning when Ethan made up his mind. He needed a change. A real change. So, he did the one thing he never thought he would do, he called his agent and told her he was taking a break from acting. He could practically hear her gasp through the phone. "Ethan, are you serious?" she asked, her voice wavering with disbelief. "You can't just stop. You've got contracts, interviews, movies lined up. You're in the middle of a career peak. Think about everything you're throwing away." "I've thought about it," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I need some time to breathe, away from all of it. I need to figure out who I am when the cameras are off." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before his agent sighed. "Fine. I can't force you. But you know the consequences, right? You walk away now, and it's not just the next movie you lose. You're risking everything." Ethan understood the gravity of her words, but his mind was made up. He couldn't keep living for others. He couldn't keep running. As he hung up the phone, a strange mix of dread and exhilaration settled in his chest. It was a risk. A huge one. But what other choice did he have? By that afternoon, Ethan found himself back at Jerry's Grill and Chomp, though this time, his heart was a little heavier. He had no idea what the future held, but there was something comforting about this place, something real. The familiar smell of sizzling burgers greeted him as he walked through the door. The usual bell above the door chimed, and Ethan immediately noticed the stark contrast between this place and the chaos of his everyday life. Here, the world felt quieter. Simpler. Jerry was standing behind the counter, flipping burgers and chatting with a regular. When he saw Ethan walk in, he gave a small nod, as if he expected him. Ethan approached the counter, his nerves suddenly rising again. "Hey, Jerry. Got a minute?" Jerry paused and wiped his hands on his apron before turning his full attention to Ethan. "Sure. What's up?" Ethan looked around the restaurant, making sure it was still relatively empty. He felt exposed, even here. This wasn't the first time he'd been recognized by fans, but today felt different. I made a big decision today," Ethan began, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm taking a break from acting. I'm walking away from the movies, the red carpets, everything." Jerry didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan felt the weight of the decision he had made, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel wrong. "You're running away from all of it?" Jerry finally asked, his tone calm but probing. "No," Ethan replied quickly, shaking his head. "I'm not running. I'm trying to find myself again. I've spent so much of my life playing a part, I forgot who I really am. And I need to find out who that is before I lose everything else." Jerry gave him a steady look, as if weighing his words. "You're gonna lose some things," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "That's a guarantee. But you're also gonna find a lot of things you didn't know you were looking for. Just don't forget what's real while you're doing it." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The simplicity of Jerry's wisdom struck him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't about fame, or money, or even success. It was about finding peace. It was about being true to himself. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. Just as Jerry turned to grab a fresh batch of fries, the door opened, and a group of customers entered. Ethan's brief moment of peace was shattered, but he didn't mind. The moment had been enough. "Don't make it all about the future, Ethan," Jerry said, his voice quiet but firm as he turned back toward the counter. "You're here now. Live now." Ethan stood there for a moment, processing Jerry's words. He was done with pretending. He didn't need to know exactly what the future held, he just needed to be present in his own life. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a shift in his soul. The tension in his body began to ease, and he felt a lightness that hadn't been there for years. The weight of his decision still loomed, but it no longer felt burdensome. It felt freeing. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't alone in this journey. He had his decision, and he had Jerry's unexpected wisdom. And as he walked out of the restaurant that afternoon, the future felt less like a threat and more like a blank canvas. There were no guarantees, no promises. But there was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the best was yet to come. The days that followed Ethan's decision were nothing like he expected. Initially, he thought he would feel liberated, free from the heavy expectations and constant media frenzy. But instead, there was an emptiness that followed him, a void he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that he regretted his choice, it was more that the path ahead was unknown and a little more daunting than he had imagined. At first, he spent his days trying to fill the space with small distractions, long walks in the park, reading books he'd never had the time for, and even attempting to write in a journal. But none of it seemed to quiet the storm in his head. He was used to being busy, constantly surrounded by people, always on the go. Now, the silence felt like a vacuum, pulling him into a deeper introspection. The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized that the real challenge wasn't walking away from Hollywood, it was figuring out who he was without it. Who was he beyond the glossy magazine covers, the flashing lights, the endless lines of script? It was a question that sat with him every morning as he woke up in his modest apartment, every time he glanced in the mirror, every time he stepped outside, feeling the weight of the world's eyes on him, despite trying to escape it. He hadn't realized just how deeply ingrained his fame was in his identity. But now, without the constant validation, it was as though he was learning to live all over again. And yet, there was a part of him that had begun to hope. One morning, about a week after his decision, he found himself walking to Jerry's Grill and Chomp again. It was becoming a familiar haven, a place he could almost call home, despite how temporary it all seemed. It was early in the day, and the restaurant was just beginning to fill up. The staff was busy, and the usual hum of activity greeted him as he entered. As he stepped up to the counter, Jerry was behind it, already in his usual rhythm of taking orders and managing the grill. But when he saw Ethan, there was a small pause in his movement, a recognition of sorts. "Back again, huh?" Jerry said, looking up and giving Ethan a knowing smile. "You planning to make this place your second home or what?" Ethan laughed, the sound feeling lighter than it had in days. "I might be. I could use some normalcy right now." "Normalcy?" Jerry repeated with a slight smirk. "You know, there's no such thing as normal. We're all just doing the best we can." "Maybe you're right," Ethan said, feeling the weight of Jerry's words settle in his chest. "I've been trying to figure out what normal even means. I guess I'm starting to realize that maybe it's not about living like everyone else. Maybe it's just about being true to who you are." Jerry looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his words. "Sounds like you're getting it. Took you long enough." Ethan smiled softly. "Yeah, I guess I was a little slow on the uptake." The conversation fell into a comfortable silence, with Jerry moving on to prepare a fresh batch of fries and burgers. Ethan sat at the counter, watching him work, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. The stillness of the moment made him realize how much he'd been running, not just from his fame, but from the discomfort of really thinking about what he wanted. What he needed. "You know," Jerry broke the silence after a while, "you're not the first person who's walked in here trying to figure things out. We all have our moments when we're lost. The trick is figuring out what to do when you're stuck. And I'm not just talking about food, by the way." Ethan's eyebrows furrowed in curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jerry wiped his hands on a towel, then leaned over the counter, his expression turning serious for the first time since Ethan had walked in. "I mean life. You can be walking along, thinking you've got it all figured out, and then bam, something hits you. Something you weren't expecting. And then you have two choices: you can keep going down the same road you were on, or you can turn around and go a different way." Ethan looked at him, realizing that Jerry wasn't just talking about the restaurant anymore. He was talking about him. About his life. I'm not sure what that other way looks like, Ethan admitted quietly. Jerry nodded, his expression softening. No one does. But you'll figure it out. Trust me, you already have all the pieces. You just need to put them together. It's not about having everything figured out, it's about doing the next right thing. And that's something you've already started. For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to such direct honesty, especially not from someone who seemed to have nothing to gain from giving it to him. But Jerry's words sunk deep into his bones, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. I'm starting to understand that, Ethan finally said, his voice steady with newfound conviction. I've spent so much of my life chasing after the next thing, the next role, the next high, that I forgot to stop and appreciate what's right in front of me. Maybe I've been so focused on the future that I never realized the present was where I needed to be. Jerry gave him a small smile. Sounds like you're getting there. It's a hard road, but it's the only one worth walking. Ethan stood up, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. For the first time in ages, he wasn't looking for validation from anyone else. He didn't need the accolades, the fame, or the perfect script. What he needed was to be present, to live authentically, without the pressure of an audience. As he left the restaurant that day, the sun felt brighter. The noise of the world still pulsed around him, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was walking his own path, one that wasn't defined by other people's expectations, but by his own choices. He didn't know where this journey would take him. But for now, he was okay with that. He was finally learning to live, not just exist. The following weeks felt like both a lifetime and a moment in time. Ethan found himself waking up with a strange sense of purpose. It was the kind of purpose that didn't come from a screenplay or a red carpet, it came from within, from the deep, often messy, but real parts of himself he had kept hidden for too long. He had stopped checking his phone constantly. The constant stream of emails, texts, and social media notifications that used to be his lifeblood now felt irrelevant. He didn't feel that same compulsion to be seen, heard, or validated. In fact, when his agent called a few days after his decision to take a break, his first instinct was to ignore it. But curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. "Ethan, are you there?" His agent's voice was both urgent and concerned. "I'm just checking in to see if you've had a chance to think about your decision." Ethan sat down on the couch, his feet resting on the coffee table. He had been avoiding the conversation, but now it was unavoidable. "I've thought about it a lot," he replied calmly. "And I'm still set on taking a break. I need this time for myself." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ethan, you're in the middle of your career's peak. You're on top of the world right now. You're literally making headlines for everything you do. This break could ruin everything you've worked for." He let out a quiet breath. "I know it's risky. But what's the point of all of this if I'm not even sure who I am anymore?" His agent sighed deeply. "Listen, I can't force you, but you need to understand the consequences. I'm just asking you to think this through. I'm here if you need anything, but the decision's yours." After a few more moments of awkward silence, Ethan hung up. He didn't feel guilty. In fact, he felt a strange weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't about the career anymore. It was about who he was becoming. Later that afternoon, he decided to do something a bit different. He pulled on a plain hoodie, a baseball cap, and some old jeans, something he hadn't worn in years. No fancy clothes, no designer shoes. Just a guy who wanted to blend in. He slipped out of his apartment and made his way to Jerry's. As usual, the restaurant had a cozy, welcoming vibe. The familiar smell of fried food and grilling meat hit him immediately, but it wasn't the food that drew him in. It was the people. It was Jerry. It was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt completely invisible here. He wasn't the actor or the celebrity. He was just another customer. Hey, Ethan. Back for more. Jerry greeted him with a knowing smile, though his tone was light and casual. Ethan returned the smile, feeling the ease of the place wrap around him like a warm blanket. I think I might be becoming a regular, he replied, his voice light. Good, Jerry said with a grin, I always have a spot for you here. What can I get you today? Ethan thought for a moment before answering, same as last time. The cheeseburger and fries. And, water. No fancy stuff. Jerry chuckled, clearly not surprised by the request. Coming right up. As Jerry turned to get his order ready, Ethan found himself looking around the restaurant. There were a few regulars scattered around, talking about everything from sports to the weather. A couple of kids were laughing over their milkshakes, and an elderly couple sat near the window, holding hands and quietly sharing a plate of fries. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't sadness, but a deep, overwhelming sense of appreciation. These people, they had something he had lost. They had a sense of belonging, of living fully in the present. They didn't need fame, or wealth, or adoration. They had what mattered most, each other. Jerry returned with his food, setting it down in front of him with a slight grin. You look like you've got a lot on your mind. Everything okay? Ethan picked up his burger, but he didn't immediately bite into it. Instead, he studied it for a moment, letting the moment stretch. Then he met Jerry's eyes. I think I'm finally getting it, he said quietly. I've been chasing all the wrong things. Fame, success, validation. But none of that matters if you're not grounded. If you don't know who you are when the cameras are off. Jerry raised an eyebrow. And do you know who you are now? Ethan smiled, though it was bittersweet. I think I'm getting closer. Not every day is perfect, but I'm figuring it out. That's the thing, Jerry said, leaning against the counter. Life's a process. You can't rush it. And the truth is, there's no finish line. You don't just wake up one day with it all figured out. Ethan nodded slowly. He had spent so many years trying to rush things. Trying to get ahead. But now, he was learning to live in the moment. To embrace the uncertainty instead of fearing it. After he finished his meal, he sat for a while, just observing the quiet energy around him. People came and went, but the rhythm of the place remained unchanged. It was comforting. This was the kind of life Ethan was beginning to crave. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't glamorous. But it was real. As he left Jerry's grill and chomped that day, Ethan realized something important. There was no magic moment when everything would fall into place. It was about taking the small, everyday steps. It was about showing up for himself, day after day, and not being afraid to step away from what everyone else expected of him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a flicker of peace in his heart. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. In fact, he was learning to embrace it. Ethan's days continued to follow a new rhythm. The Hollywood hustle seemed like a distant memory, though occasionally, his mind would wander back to it, back to the flashing lights, the red carpets, the rush of adoration. But now, those thoughts were more of a faint echo than a present reality. They no longer consumed him. He had found solace in the simplicity of his life, in the ordinary moments that others took for granted. But the world he left behind wasn't quite finished with him. One afternoon, as Ethan was sitting in a small cafe near his apartment, working on his latest attempt at journaling, his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but that never stopped him before. Curious, he picked it up. Hello. A familiar voice came through the other end. Ethan. It's Mia. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Mia was his ex-girlfriend, an actress herself, though not as famous as he had been. They had parted ways amicably, both realizing they were living parallel lives that never quite intersected in a meaningful way. Yet, there was always a part of him that wondered what might have been. Mia. Wow, it's been a while. How are you? I'm good, she said, though her tone sounded more serious than he was used to. Listen, I didn't want to leave you hanging after our last conversation, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Ethan felt a pang of curiosity, mixed with a bit of anxiety. What's going on? Well, she paused, as though considering her words carefully. I've been hearing things. Rumors. About why you left everything behind. And I just wanted to check in with you. I know it's a big change, and I wanted to make sure you're okay. I'm worried about you, Ethan. Ethan hadn't expected this conversation. He wasn't used to people, especially those from his past, checking in on him. The fame had always kept people at a distance, even those who had once been close. But now, Mia's voice carried something else, genuine concern. I'm fine, Mia. Really, he said softly. It's just that. I needed to take a step back. I wasn't happy. I was lost, honestly. And I needed time to figure things out. She was silent for a beat, probably processing his words. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. I get it. But Ethan. You need to understand that people notice when someone steps away like that. People care about you. They're not just fans, they're your audience, your friends. And sometimes, when you disappear, it leaves them with more questions than answers. I'm just worried that you're isolating yourself too much. Ethan leaned back in his chair, contemplating her words. She wasn't wrong. He had, in many ways, built his entire identity on the opinions of others, his fans, his colleagues, even strangers who only saw him on a screen. But what Mia didn't fully understand, what neither of them truly understood when they were together, was how exhausting that pressure could be. I don't want to go back to that life, Ethan finally said, his voice steady but resolute. I've made peace with that. I'm not hiding from anyone. I'm just finding a new path. And I need to do this alone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Mia spoke again, her voice softened. I understand. I just want you to know that you don't have to do it alone. You have people who care about you. Including me. Ethan felt a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. Mia had always been a supportive presence in his life, but he knew their relationship had always been built on the fast-paced world of Hollywood. In the quieter, simpler life he was trying to build, their worlds didn't quite fit together anymore. I appreciate that, Mia, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. I really do. But this is something I have to figure out for myself. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, okay. But if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be here. Ethan hung up the phone, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. Mia's call had triggered something inside of him, a reminder that people noticed when you were gone, even if you didn't want them to. And that was both comforting and unsettling. He wasn't used to people worrying about him, at least not in this way. In Hollywood, there were always people around, people who needed him for this project or that, people who admired him from afar, people who only saw the version of him that they wanted to see. But Mia's concern was different. It was genuine, a reflection of who he had been before the fame consumed him. But as he sat there, looking out the window of the cafe, Ethan realized something important. He couldn't live his life to satisfy other people's expectations. Not anymore. If he did, he would never find the peace he was searching for. He had to do what was right for him, even if it meant disappointing others or leaving them behind. It wasn't that he didn't care about Mia, or his friends, or even his fans. He did. But he had spent too much time living for everyone else. Now, it was time to live for himself. The phone call with Mia served as a turning point for Ethan. It was a reminder that, despite his efforts to step away from the spotlight, he couldn't fully escape the impact of his past life. People cared about him, and that was both a blessing and a burden. But the call also reaffirmed his resolve. He had to keep moving forward, to stay true to his own journey, regardless of how others might perceive it. In the days that followed, Ethan continued to explore this quieter life. He began to notice small shifts within himself, ripples of change that were subtle but meaningful. His confidence grew, not because he had fame or recognition, but because he had begun to understand that true peace came from within. A few days after his conversation with Mia, Ethan found himself back at Jerry's Grill and Chomp, sitting in the same corner booth where it all started. The restaurant had become his refuge, a place where he could escape the world and its expectations. The noise of the outside world seemed to fade the moment he walked through those doors, replaced by the familiar hum of conversations and the sizzle of the grill. This time, however, something was different. There was a new energy in the air, an unusual tension that Ethan couldn't quite place. As he sat down and opened the menu, he glanced up and noticed a familiar face walking toward him. It was a young man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a well-worn jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had a look of determination about him, someone who was clearly used to pushing through obstacles. But there was something else in his expression, something raw and vulnerable that caught Ethan's attention. The man approached Ethan's table, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, you're Ethan, right?" Ethan looked up, slightly surprised. "Yeah, that's me. How's it going?" The man hesitated, then sat down without waiting for an invitation. "I figured I'd just come over and introduce myself. My name's Ben." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Nice to meet you, Ben. What can I do for you?" Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, running a hand through his messy hair. "I know this might sound weird, but I've been following your career for a while. I used to watch your movies all the time, and I gotta say, I really respected the way you handled the industry." Ethan nodded slowly. He'd heard that kind of thing before, people who had admired his work from afar, people who wanted a piece of the fame that came with knowing him. But there was something different about Ben. His words didn't feel like empty flattery. There was a sincerity to his tone that piqued Ethan's curiosity. Ben continued, his voice more urgent now. "But that's not why I'm here. I mean, I guess it's part of it, but I've been going through some stuff, and I heard you were stepping away from the limelight. I've been struggling with some personal things, and I just wanted to talk to someone who gets it, you know." Ethan's interest peaked. This wasn't the usual fan interaction. This was something else entirely. Ben wasn't here for an autograph or a selfie, he was here for something much deeper. Ethan leaned back in his seat, regarding Ben carefully. "I get it," he said slowly. "I know what it's like to be stuck in a place where nothing makes sense. But I'm not exactly the best person to talk to about all that right now. I'm still figuring things out myself." Ben shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I get that. I guess we're both trying to figure out life, huh?" Ethan laughed, feeling an unexpected connection to this stranger. It was rare for him to feel this kind of camaraderie, especially in a world where everything was constantly changing, where the people around him often had agendas. They spent the next hour talking about their lives. Ben revealed that he had once been on a similar path to Ethan's. He had dreams of making it big in the world of music, a singer-songwriter with a growing following. But his journey had taken a different turn when his personal life fell apart. His bandmates had left him after a major fallout, and the pressure of the music industry had left him burned out and disillusioned. He was still struggling to pick up the pieces. Ethan shared a little about his own struggles, though he didn't go into detail. He didn't have to. Ben understood. There was a quiet empathy between them, an unspoken bond forged in the fire of their shared experience. By the time their conversation came to an end, they had both opened up in ways they hadn't expected. Ben had made Ethan realize that he wasn't alone in his struggles, that others were going through their own battles, trying to find their way in a world that didn't always make sense. Before Ben left, he paused and turned to Ethan. "You know, I didn't expect to find someone like you here today. I thought maybe you'd be some big-shot celebrity who wouldn't even give me the time of day. But you're different. You actually listen. That means a lot." Ethan smiled, feeling something shift inside of him. "I think we're all just trying to find our way. We're not so different after all." Ben nodded, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "Yeah, you're right. Thanks for talking to me, man. I really appreciate it." As Ben walked out of the restaurant, Ethan sat back in his booth, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. He had come to Jerry's looking for peace and solitude, but what he had found was something far more valuable, an unlikely friendship. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Ben kept in touch. They met up at Jerry's a few more times, sharing stories of their pasts and the struggles they faced. It wasn't always deep, philosophical conversation. Sometimes it was just two guys chatting about music, movies, or the mundane details of everyday life. But there was something healing about it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could be himself, without the pressure of who he was supposed to be. This friendship, born out of chance, became one of the most meaningful connections in Ethan's life. Ben wasn't impressed by his fame or status. He didn't want anything from him. He simply saw Ethan for who he was, a person, just like him, trying to find a place in the world. And in that, Ethan found something he had been searching for all along: authenticity. For the first time in years, he wasn't defined by his career or his image. He was simply Ethan. And that, he realized, was enough. It had been a few weeks since Ethan's last deep conversation with Ben. Life seemed to be falling into a rhythm that he hadn't known in years, peaceful, fulfilling, and almost unrecognizable compared to the chaos of his former celebrity life. He was finding joy in the small moments, like taking long walks through the city or sipping coffee at his favorite cafe, where no one recognized him as the Hollywood star he once was. But just as everything seemed to be settling into place, the past had a way of creeping in when he least expected it. Ethan was walking down the street on a brisk Saturday morning when he noticed a group of paparazzi gathered outside a building. The cameras were pointed toward the entrance, and Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. He recognized the face of one of the photographers. It was Rick, an old paparazzo who had stalked him for years, showing up at every red carpet, every event, always looking for the perfect shot. Ethan tried to slip by unnoticed, hoping to avoid the familiar tension that came with being chased by cameras. But just as he turned the corner, he heard Rick's voice call out. "Hey, Ethan. Long time no see. Thought you were hiding out in some remote island, living off the grid?" Ethan froze in place, the weight of the question hanging in the air. He didn't turn around, but he knew the camera lenses were already focused on him. The buzz of the paparazzi felt like a sudden weight pressing down on his chest. "Not hiding, Rick. Just living," Ethan called back, trying to keep his tone light, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. Rick wasn't deterred. "Living, huh? Sure, sure. So, what's life like for Hollywood's former golden boy? You still trying to get away from the world, or is this some kind of comeback?" The word stung. Ethan hadn't anticipated that his past would catch up with him so quickly, but he wasn't prepared for the raw, invasive nature of the questions. He had made a promise to himself that he wouldn't let his old life define him anymore, but there it was, lurking right in front of him, forcing him to face it once again. "Not a comeback, Rick," Ethan said with a forced chuckle, trying to brush off the situation. "Just trying to find some peace, you know." He continued walking, keeping his head down, but Rick wasn't about to let the moment slip away so easily. He kept following, snapping photos as Ethan hurried to put more distance between them. The sound of camera shutters filled the air, and Ethan's pulse quickened. He couldn't escape it. The past was always one step behind, just waiting to catch up. Ethan ducked into the nearest store, a small independent bookstore that he loved to visit whenever he needed to clear his head. The familiar scent of paper and ink welcomed him, and he breathed a sigh of relief as the door closed behind him, shutting out the noise and chaos. The store was quiet, save for a few patrons browsing the shelves. Ethan made his way to the back of the store, where he often found a small corner with a comfortable armchair. He sat down, leaning back and trying to shake off the lingering unease that the paparazzi's questions had caused. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the chaos of his old life, the constant flashing lights, the pressure to be perfect, the expectation to always be on. It had been overwhelming, suffocating at times, and even though he had made the decision to leave that behind, it still followed him. He couldn't deny that the sting of the past still lingered, like a scar that refused to heal completely. As he sat there in the chair, his mind wandered back to a time when he had been at the peak of his career, the red carpets, the awards, the endless stream of interviews. He had been so consumed by it all that he hadn't realized how much of himself he was losing along the way. The attention, the accolades, the adoration of fans, they had all become like a drug, and he had become addicted to the high. But now, looking back, he understood. All of it, the fame, the lights, the applause, it had been a mask. A mask that hid the loneliness, the isolation, and the fear of not being enough without the validation of the world. It was a constant cycle of self-doubt and the need for approval, and he had gotten lost in it. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a soft voice. "You look like you could use a break." He opened his eyes to find an older woman standing in front of him, a friendly smile on her face. She had graying hair and kind eyes, and she was holding a stack of books in her hands. Ethan smiled, a little surprised by the sudden interruption, but grateful for it nonetheless. "I could definitely use one. It's been a weird day." The woman chuckled softly and set the books down on a nearby shelf. "Life has a way of throwing us curveballs, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of comfort in her presence. "Yeah, it sure does." The woman tilted her head, regarding him for a moment before speaking again. "You look familiar. You wouldn't happen to be Ethan Westbrook, would you?" Ethan's stomach sank for a moment. He had hoped that his days in the spotlight were behind him, but it seemed that even in this quiet bookstore, the past had a way of catching up. He nodded reluctantly. "That's me," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. The woman's eyes lit up, but not in the way he had expected. There was no excitement, no eagerness to ask for a selfie or autographs. Instead, there was a softness to her gaze. "I thought so. My daughter used to watch your movies all the time. She was a huge fan." Ethan gave a half-smile, feeling the weight of the conversation shift. "She must have a good taste in movies." The woman smiled warmly. "She does. You've probably made an impact on a lot of people, even if you don't realize it. But it sounds like you're looking for something else now. Something quieter, maybe." Ethan blinked, taken aback by how perceptive she was. It wasn't something he had said aloud, but somehow, she had seen through him. "I guess I am," he admitted. The woman nodded, as though she understood perfectly. "It's not always easy to find what we're looking for, but I think you're on the right path." There was something comforting in her words, reminder that he wasn't the only one who had ever struggled to find his way. And for the first time that day, the weight on his shoulders lifted slightly. As Ethan left the bookstore later, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. The past was always going to be there, in one form or another. But it no longer had the power to control him. The past didn't define him. The choices he made now, in the present, would shape his future. And with that, he stepped back into the world outside, one where he could move forward, no matter how many reminders of the past might pop up along the way. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan's days had taken on a new rhythm since his chance encounter with the older woman in the bookstore. His life felt quieter now, more intentional. He had let go of the rush and bustle of fame, seeking something that was more grounded and real. But as much as he relished the calm, there were still moments when the weight of his past choices loomed over him, threatening to pull him back into the whirlwind of attention and expectations. It was on one of these mornings, as Ethan walked along a quiet street near his apartment, that he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a second, unsure if he should pick it up. The last thing he wanted was more noise from his old life. But something tugged at him, and he answered. "Hello," he said, his voice cautious. "Ethan Westbrook," a woman's voice on the other end asked, sharp and businesslike. "That's me," he replied, wondering who this could be. "Hi, this is Alicia Thompson. I'm a producer over at Sunset Productions. I wanted to reach out to you about a potential project we're working on. Would you be available to meet?" Ethan froze for a moment, his mind racing. Sunset Productions. The name was familiar. They were known for their high-budget films and hit series, ones that he had once been a part of, back when he was at the top of his game. It was all coming back in a flash, the pressure, the glitz, and the constant demands. He opened his mouth to decline, to tell her that he was done with that life, but something held him back. There was a curiosity stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Was it possible that he could finally use his past for something meaningful? "Sure," he said finally, surprising himself. "I'm free this afternoon." Later that day, Ethan found himself sitting in a modern, sleek office overlooking the bustling city skyline. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air as Alicia Thompson, a well-dressed, sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, sat across from him, a confident smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I know you've stepped away from the industry for a while, but I wanted to pitch something that might interest you. It's a project unlike anything you've done before." Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Go on," he said, his interest piqued despite himself. Alicia unfolded a set of documents and pushed them toward him. "We're developing a new series, a gritty, character-driven drama. It's about a former celebrity who has walked away from the spotlight and is now facing the repercussions of living in the shadows. The role would be heavily based on your own experiences." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly the kind of project that could either pull him back into the madness of fame or allow him to tell a story that was deeply personal, something he could truly connect with. But even as the idea settled in his mind, a part of him hesitated. "You want me to play someone like me?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Alicia nodded. "Precisely. The character is struggling to navigate life outside of the public eye, dealing with the demons of his past and the people who still expect him to be the person they once saw on screen. It's raw. It's real. And I think it could be incredibly cathartic for you." Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Part of him recoiled at the idea, did he really want to revisit that part of his life? But another part, a more hopeful part, felt the lure of telling a story that was uniquely his. This could be his chance to explore the very themes he had been grappling with for years, fame, identity, and the search for meaning outside of the spotlight. "Sounds complicated," he said, his voice low. "It is," Alicia agreed. "But that's what makes it powerful. And I believe you're the perfect person to bring this character to life. It would be a challenge, yes, but one that I think could be worth it." Ethan sat there for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had walked away from the fame and the endless cycle of superficiality that had once defined his existence, but this could be something different. This could be his chance to reshape his narrative, to take control of his own story. "What's the catch?" Ethan asked, still unsure whether he was ready to dive back into the world of show business, even if it was in a more personal way. Alicia's expression softened, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. "The catch is that it's going to require you to dig deep, Ethan. You'll have to confront parts of your past that you've been running from. But I believe you can do it. And more importantly, I believe you'll come out stronger on the other side." Ethan stared out the window for a moment, watching the city below. The decision was hanging in the air, an invisible force that was impossible to ignore. The past was calling him back, but this time, it wasn't asking him to return to the life he had once known. It was asking him to take the pieces of that life and reshape them into something new. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it." Alicia's smile widened. "I knew you'd say yes. Welcome back, Ethan. You won't regret it." As he left Sunset Productions that afternoon, Ethan felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. There was a sense of excitement, sure, but also a quiet sense of fear. He had just agreed to revisit the very thing he had tried to leave behind. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't about reliving the fame or chasing the spotlight. This was about confronting his own truth and telling a story that could resonate with others. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't running from his past anymore. He was embracing it, and in doing so, perhaps he would finally find the peace he had been searching for all along. Ethan's decision to return to the world of film, even if it was in a role that mirrored his own life, wasn't without its share of internal conflict. The idea had seemed exciting in the sterile, professional atmosphere of Alicia's office, but as he sat in his car later that evening, the weight of his decision hit him with full force. Could he really confront the ghosts of his past and allow himself to become vulnerable in front of the world again? His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it. But something in his gut told him to check it. It was a text from Ben. "Hey, man. You okay? Haven't heard from you in a while. Let's grab a beer soon. We need to talk." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then quickly typed out a response. "Yeah, everything's fine. Busy day. Let's meet tomorrow." He put the phone down, staring at the steering wheel as the weight of his decisions pressed down on him again. He wasn't just returning to the industry, he was opening the door to an entirely new kind of vulnerability. Could he handle it? The next afternoon, Ethan met Ben at a local dive bar they used to frequent. It was a cozy spot, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and the atmosphere felt like home. The faint hum of conversation and the clinking of beer bottles filled the air as Ben waved him over. "Hey, man. Glad you could make it," Ben said, offering a warm smile as Ethan slid into the booth. "You always pick the best places," Ethan replied with a grin. Ben raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile on his face. "You think I'm the only one who picks places around here?" Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Okay, fine. But you know I've been a little out of the loop lately." Ben leaned back, studying Ethan for a moment. "So, what's been going on? I've been getting this feeling you've been avoiding me lately. You sure everything's okay?" Ethan sighed, his mind racing as he decided how to approach this conversation. He hadn't planned on telling Ben just yet about his decision to take on the role. He wasn't sure how Ben would react. After all, it was a huge leap back into a world that had nearly destroyed him. I've got something to tell you," Ethan said, his voice lowering as he leaned in a little closer. Ben's eyes narrowed in concern. "What's going on?" "I met with a producer today," Ethan began, trying to find the right words. "She's got a new project, and, well, I agreed to take on a role." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Wait a second. You, acting again? I thought you were done with all that. What kind of role are we talking about?" Ethan paused, trying to choose his words carefully. "It's not like the old stuff. It's a series about a guy who walks away from the spotlight and tries to find himself again. It's a little close to home, actually. The character's a former celebrity who's dealing with all the things I've been trying to avoid." Ben let out a slow breath, his face softening. "I wasn't expecting that. But I can see why you'd do it. You're kind of giving yourself a chance to tell your own story, right?" Ethan nodded, relieved that Ben seemed to understand. "Yeah. I think so. But it's also kind of terrifying." I don't know if I'm ready to face all of that again. I've spent so much time trying to distance myself from everything, and now I'm supposed to jump back in and relive it. Ben leaned forward, placing a hand on the table, his eyes intense. Listen, man. I get it. The whole fame thing, it's a beast. But if anyone can handle this, it's you. You've been through a hell of a lot, and now you've got the chance to take control of your narrative. It's not about being the actor you were before. It's about showing everyone the real you. Ethan looked down at the table, contemplating Ben's words. For the first time, he felt like maybe he could do this. Maybe telling his story could be the closure he had been searching for. I don't know, Ben, Ethan said softly, a hint of doubt still lingering. It's not just about the role. It's everything that comes with it, the interviews, the cameras, the expectations. I'm not sure if I can go back to all of that. Ben chuckled, shaking his head. You're already back, whether you like it or not. You've got the chance to use it on your terms now. And you don't have to do it alone. We've got your back. Whatever happens, we'll be right here. Ethan met Ben's eyes, feeling a flicker of hope. His friend was right. He didn't have to face this alone. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was navigating this world in isolation. He had his friends, his support system. And for the first time, that seemed like enough. Thanks, Ben, Ethan said, his voice thick with gratitude. You're right. I've got to stop running from this. It's time to face it head on. Ben smiled, clinking his beer bottle against Ethan's. Here's to facing our fears and owning our stories. Later that night, as Ethan walked home under the dim streetlights, he found himself thinking about what Ben had said. He wasn't alone. He had a team of people who believed in him, who supported him. And maybe that was all he really needed to start making sense of his chaotic life. As he walked past a familiar cafe, he paused, glancing through the window at a group of people laughing and chatting over coffee. He smiled softly to himself. There was a time when he would have been so consumed by the pressure of living up to an image that he never would have stopped to appreciate these simple moments. But now, he had the freedom to do so. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever came next, he could handle it. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But with his feet firmly planted in the present, Ethan knew that he was ready to take on whatever challenge life threw his way. Ethan's first day back on set felt surreal. It had been years since he had stepped into the whirlwind of lights, cameras, and the constant hum of activity that came with a production. But this was different. It wasn't a flashy blockbuster, full of glossy smiles and endless photo ops. It was raw, real, and far more intimate. And despite the anxiety gnawing at him, Ethan couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. He walked through the familiar doors of the soundstage, greeted by the bustle of crew members setting up equipment, adjusting lights, and preparing for a long day of shooting. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the sound of conversation, and for a moment, Ethan felt like he had never left. "Hey, Ethan. Welcome back," a familiar voice called out. It was Lucas, the production assistant who used to work on several of Ethan's old films. The young man had always been eager and enthusiastic, and he greeted Ethan like an old friend. "Hey, Lucas," Ethan said with a smile, grateful for the warm welcome. "It's been a while, huh?" "Yeah, a few years." Lucas replied, grinning. "But you've been missed, man. Seriously, it's great to see you back." Ethan nodded, trying to shake off the nervous tension. "Thanks. Let's just hope I haven't lost it." As they walked further into the set, Ethan felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. This was the world he had once thrived in, the world of high stakes, pressure, and a constant need to perform. But now, it all seemed different. It was no longer about proving himself or maintaining an image. It was about telling a story. His story. The director, Samantha Clark, spotted him as soon as he entered the room. Samantha was a seasoned filmmaker known for her no-nonsense approach and her ability to bring out deep, authentic performances from her actors. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, it was clear that she had a vision, and she expected nothing less than the best. "Ethan," she greeted him, her tone professional but warm. "Good to see you. Ready to get to work?" Ethan smiled nervously, trying to suppress the flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Ready as I'll ever be." Samantha's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as though assessing him. Then she nodded. "We're starting with a scene in the apartment. Your character is confronting his reflection after a public breakdown. It's a pivotal moment, so I need you to go deep. You're not just acting here, you're living it. Got it?" Ethan swallowed hard. Confronting his own reflection. He could feel the weight of that line, not just as a character, but as a man who had spent years trying to escape the image of who he used to be. This wasn't going to be easy. But it was exactly what he had signed up for. "Got it," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside. As the crew continued to prepare the scene, Ethan took a seat in the corner, watching and listening. He had been on so many sets before, but now it felt different. He wasn't just an actor anymore, he was part of a larger story, one that was deeply personal and rooted in the reality of his life. The scene they were about to shoot was heavy. His character, a former celebrity whose fall from grace had been widely publicized, was standing in front of a bathroom mirror, grappling with the mess of his own life. It was a moment of reckoning. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of it pressed down on him. "Okay, let's get in position," Samantha called out, snapping him back to the present. Ethan stood up and walked to the center of the set, where the bathroom mirror had been carefully constructed. The crew set the lights, casting a dim, moody glow across the room. Everything was quiet except for the sound of Samantha's voice. "Whenever you're ready, Ethan," she said. For a long moment, Ethan stood there, looking at his reflection. The image that stared back at him was a mix of familiar and foreign. It was a face he knew, but it wasn't the face that the world remembered. The man in the mirror was someone who had been broken and rebuilt, someone who had tried to outrun his past but could never quite escape it. He took a deep breath, remembering the emotions he had felt in those moments of crisis, those moments of weakness. He remembered the anger, the regret, the sadness. It wasn't hard to access. It was all still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting to break free. And then, he let it out. He slammed his fist against the sink in front of him, the sound echoing through the room. His breathing grew shallow as his gaze locked onto his reflection, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything he had tried to bury. The fame. The loss. The disappointment. The tears came unbidden, streaming down his face, and he didn't try to stop them. It wasn't just acting. It was catharsis. It was real. Samantha called out, "Cut." The room fell silent, and Ethan stood there, his chest heaving with emotion. For a moment, he didn't move, too lost in the moment to care about anything else. Then, a hand rested on his shoulder. He turned to see Samantha, her face unreadable. "You did great," she said quietly. "I know that was hard. But that was real. That's what we need." Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes and trying to collect himself. It's hard to go back to that place." Samantha gave him a sympathetic look. "I know. But you're doing great. Trust me." As the day went on, Ethan felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. It wasn't easy to open up in such a raw way, but he knew it was necessary. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding behind a character. He was allowing the audience to see him for who he really was, flaws and all. Later that evening, as he walked back to his apartment, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. This wasn't just about playing a role anymore. It was about confronting his past, his fears, and his weaknesses, and finally making peace with them. He wasn't the man he used to be, and that was okay. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly move forward. As the weeks passed, Ethan's days on set became a blur of rehearsals, takes, and endless lines of dialogue. Each scene seemed to dive deeper into the complexity of his character, a man struggling with the duality of fame and failure, and Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The further he immersed himself in the role, the more it mirrored his own life. It was as though every line of dialogue and every action was a reminder of the personal battles he had fought, and continued to fight. Despite the long hours and emotional toll, something inside of him began to shift. It was as if he were learning to release the tight grip he had held on his past for so long. Yet, for every step forward, it seemed there was another obstacle waiting for him. One afternoon, during a break in filming, Ethan found himself standing alone in the parking lot, his eyes scanning the horizon as he tried to clear his mind. The weight of the scenes he had just filmed pressed down on him, and he needed a moment of solitude to regain his balance. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, recognizing the number immediately. It was Alicia, the producer who had first approached him about the role. He hesitated, but then answered. "Ethan," Alicia's voice came through, steady and calm. "We need to talk." Ethan leaned against the car, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "What's up?" "There's been some talk. The press is starting to catch wind of the project," Alicia continued. "They're getting curious about you, about your return. Some outlets are even suggesting that this role might be a personal reflection of your own struggles." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The press? He hadn't anticipated this part. Sure, the project had been low-key so far, but he knew how quickly things could spiral out of control in the entertainment world. "Is that a problem?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice even. "I don't think it's an immediate issue," Alicia replied, "but we need to be careful. If this goes public, the narrative could change. You know how the media loves to spin things. You'll be under the microscope again, Ethan." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. The last thing he wanted was to relive the public spectacle of his past. He had done everything in his power to escape that life, to build something more authentic. But it seemed like no matter how hard he tried, the past always had a way of catching up with him. "I don't want this to turn into a circus again," he muttered. "I'm doing this for myself, Alicia. Not for the press." "I know," she said, her tone softening. "And I respect that. But we need to be ready for whatever comes. The last thing we want is for this project to be overshadowed by rumors or personal drama. You've got a lot to gain here, Ethan. Don't let the noise mess with your focus." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath. "I'll handle it. Just let me focus on the work." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then Alicia spoke again. "I know you will. Just remember, this isn't the old Hollywood. You're in control now." After the call ended, Ethan stared at his phone for a long moment, a sense of unease creeping over him. He had fought so hard to regain his footing in the world he once inhabited. But now it seemed like the very thing he was trying to escape, fame and public scrutiny, was starting to creep back into his life. That night, when he got home to his apartment, he tried to push the thoughts aside. He had a job to do, and he needed to stay focused. But as he sat down to go over his lines for the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift again. The next day, on set, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Crew members were whispering more than usual, casting furtive glances in Ethan's direction. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their attention, as if the air around him had thickened. As Samantha called action for the next scene, Ethan tried to drown out the buzz in his head. The scene was a tense confrontation between his character and his ex-wife, a woman who had once been part of his life but who now represented everything he had lost. It was a painful scene, emotionally charged, and as Ethan delivered his lines, he could feel his voice cracking with the weight of the character's despair. He didn't even need to act, the emotions flowed so naturally that it was almost frightening. After a particularly intense take, Samantha called, "Cut," and the crew went into a brief pause. The silence was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing, a sound that shouldn't have been surprising in the chaos of a film set, but for some reason, it felt jarring. One of the crew members, a production assistant, hurried over to hand Ethan his phone. "Sorry to interrupt," the assistant said, her voice apologetic. "It's a call for you." Ethan took the phone, his heart racing as he looked at the caller ID. It was from his agent. "Ethan," his agent's voice came through, laced with a hint of urgency. "You need to be aware that some outlets are starting to speculate about your personal life. There's a buzz surrounding the film, and some are already making connections between the character you're playing and your own experiences. It's about to hit the tabloids. You should get ahead of this before it gets out of hand." Ethan's stomach dropped. This was exactly what he had feared. The last thing he wanted was for his personal life to become the story. He wasn't ready for the press or the public to start drawing conclusions about his life. "Is there any way to stop it?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "There's not much you can do to control the narrative once it's out there," his agent replied. "But we can manage it. It might be time for a public statement. Clear things up before the rumors spiral." Ethan's mind raced, but he knew there was no avoiding it. The press had always been a double-edged sword. They could make you, or they could break you. As he hung up the phone, his nerves flared. He had hoped to be in control of his comeback, but it seemed like the world had its own plans. And no matter how much he tried to keep his personal life private, the spotlight had a way of finding him. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the weight of the impending media storm hanging over him like a dark cloud. But despite the anxiety gnawing at him, there was a strange sense of clarity as well. He wasn't the man he once was, and he had no intention of letting the world dictate his narrative again. It was time to face the spotlight, not with fear, but with the confidence that he had earned. As the day wound down and Ethan walked out of the set, the evening air cool against his skin, he felt something shift within him. The pressure was there, but so was his determination. This time, he wasn't just an actor playing a role. This time, he was ready to control his own story. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in a storm. The phone call with his agent had made everything real. The press was circling, and no matter how much he tried to distance himself from the noise, it was always just a click away. The tabloids were quick to draw connections between his character and his real life, speculating about his own struggles, relationships, and career comeback. It felt like déjà vu, a reminder of the chaotic media frenzy that had defined his past. The next few days were a blur. Rumors swirled. Headlines screamed, "Is Ethan Blake's comeback a public therapy session?" and "The actor who lost it all, now playing the role of his life." Every click, every scroll on his phone seemed to bring him closer to reliving the nightmare he had fought so hard to escape. The studio, too, was feeling the heat. Alicia had reached out again, urging Ethan to prepare for a press tour, to engage with the media before the narrative got out of hand. But Ethan wasn't ready. Not yet. Sitting in his apartment that evening, staring at the screen of his phone, he felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, with the weight of every expectation pressing down on him. If he stepped forward, he could risk falling into the same chaos as before, but if he stayed where he was, he would never move forward. The question remained, what kind of man did he want to be? Just as he was about to lock the phone, another call came through. This time, it was from Samantha. She'd been quiet the past few days, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the production would address the media frenzy. "Hey, Sam," he answered, his voice weary. "Ethan, how's it going?" Samantha's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. She was always direct, but today, it seemed like she was treading carefully. "I'm managing," he replied, rubbing his temple. "The media's making this whole thing more about me than about the film. It's overwhelming." "I know. And I'm sorry this is happening now, she said. But here's the thing, you can't control how the press spins it. They'll write whatever they want, but they can't control the film. They can't control your performance. They can't control the work we're doing here. What matters is that we stay focused on that. Ethan let out a sigh, grateful for Samantha's no-nonsense attitude. But there was something else on his mind. Do you think the press is right? That I'm just playing a version of myself in this role? Samantha paused before answering. I don't think you're playing yourself. You're playing a character who has experienced loss, who has faced failure. There are similarities between the two, sure. But that's not the point. The point is that you're telling a story, and that story is bigger than you. Ethan felt a twinge of relief, but it was short-lived. I just don't want this to spiral out of control. I don't want the press to ruin what I'm trying to build. That's why you need to decide how you're going to engage with it, Samantha continued. The moment you give them control, they'll run wild. If you take charge, if you control the narrative, they'll have no choice but to follow your lead. Ethan's mind raced. He had never been a fan of the spotlight, but it was clear now that he had to face it head-on. Samantha was right, he couldn't let the media define him. Not again. I get it, he said, feeling a new sense of resolve forming within him. I'll handle it. Samantha chuckled softly. I know you will. Just stay focused. The work you're doing here is going to speak for itself. Everything else is just noise. The next day, Ethan decided to take control of the situation. He called his agent and set up a meeting to discuss a public statement. It was time to address the speculation head-on, to clarify his intentions and make it clear that the role he was playing was just that, a role, not a reflection of his personal life. The press statement was carefully crafted, and Ethan approved every word. It was brief but direct. I understand that the parallels between the character I'm playing and my own experiences are hard to ignore, but I want to be clear, this role is a work of fiction. I'm honored to be part of a project that allows me to explore deep, human emotions, but this is not a reflection of my personal struggles. I am focused on the work, and I hope the audience will focus on that too. Thank you for your understanding. It wasn't a groundbreaking statement, but it was enough to address the growing concerns. Ethan knew it wasn't going to silence the press completely, but it was a start. It put him back in control, something he hadn't felt in years. The statement was released, and almost immediately, the press buzzed with mixed reactions. Some respected his candidness, while others tried to dig deeper, questioning whether he was hiding something or simply trying to distance himself from the character. But that was the nature of the media, no matter what you did, it was never enough. Despite the noise, Ethan felt a sense of relief. He had taken a step toward reclaiming his life. He was no longer just reacting to the media's demands. He was standing firm. Back on set the following day, the energy felt different. There was a renewed sense of purpose, not just from Ethan but from the entire crew. Even Samantha seemed more energized, her focus sharp as she directed each scene with precision. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he was truly living in the moment. The tension from the outside world had receded, and all that mattered was the work, the craft. During one of the scenes, he found himself lost in the performance, so much so that when Samantha called, "Cut," he was momentarily disoriented. "That was incredible," she said, her voice full of admiration. "That's the energy I've been looking for." Ethan smiled, his heart light for the first time in a while. The fight to protect his space, to protect the work, had been exhausting. But it was paying off. It wasn't just about reclaiming his past or facing the spotlight, it was about moving forward, building something new, and doing it on his own terms. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most empowering thing he had ever done. The phone buzzed again in his pocket. Another notification. Another headline. But this time, Ethan didn't feel the familiar sting of dread. He smiled, tucked the phone back in his pocket, and went back to work. Ethan was standing in front of the mirror in his trailer, adjusting his costume for the next scene. The studio had prepared an elaborate set, and this one was particularly intense. He was playing a confrontation between his character, David, and his estranged father, a powerful, emotional moment that would push his acting skills to their limit. As he ran his fingers over the fabric of the jacket, his reflection in the mirror reminded him of how far he had come. The image staring back at him wasn't just the actor playing a role, but a man who had struggled, fallen, and climbed his way back up again. He had faced countless challenges, both in his career and personal life, but now, more than ever, it felt like he had found a new sense of purpose. But still, something gnawed at him, a quiet unease that lingered in the background. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was building to a tipping point, and it wasn't going to be as simple as keeping his focus on the work. The press statement had offered temporary relief, but Ethan knew the media would always be looking for the next angle. They never stopped. Their hunger for scandal was insatiable, and even if they didn't find the drama they were hoping for, they would make it up. And then, there was the looming challenge of navigating the upcoming press tour. He knew the studio had already started preparing for it: interviews, appearances, social media content, and everything else that came with it. It was all part of the machine that fueled the entertainment world, and though Ethan had never been particularly keen on the attention, he knew it was part of the deal now. The sound of a knock on his trailer door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in." Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. The door creaked open, and it was Samantha, holding a script in her hand, her expression neutral but intense. "We're ready for you," she said, her gaze flicking to the costume he was wearing. "You look good. You ready for this?" Ethan nodded, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. "Yeah. Let's do it." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "I've been thinking about how this film is going to go down. It's big. I can feel it. The whole project is building towards something major." Ethan met her eyes in the mirror. "I know. But I've been thinking about something too. This press tour, do you think I'm ready for it? I mean, it's going to be a circus, right? The media is going to have a field day with me, no matter what I do." Samantha considered this for a moment, her expression softening. "Look, it's not going to be easy. But I believe in you. You've already proven yourself by stepping back into the game. And if anyone can handle the press, it's you." Ethan turned around to face her, his voice serious. "I just don't want to fall back into that old trap. The headlines, the gossip, the rumors. It's all exhausting, Sam. You know how it was before. I don't want to go back to that." Samantha sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "I get it. I know it's not easy, and I can't promise it'll be smooth sailing. But think of it like this: you're in control now. You have the power to guide the narrative. It's your story to tell, Ethan." For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, absorbing her words. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to face it all again. But deep down, he knew that if he let fear dictate his actions, he would be giving up. Giving up on the work he loved, and giving up on everything he had fought for. "Okay," he said, a quiet determination settling in his chest. "I'll take control. I'll show them that I'm not the same guy I was before. This time, it's about the work, not the drama." "That's the spirit," Samantha said with a smile. "Now, let's make sure the world sees that." The scene they were about to shoot was intense, requiring Ethan to dig deep into emotions he hadn't tapped into in years. His character, David, was confronting his father about years of abandonment, betrayal, and painful memories. The dialogue was raw, cutting deep into the heart of unresolved grief. As the cameras rolled, Ethan felt every word. He wasn't acting. He was reliving the moment in a way that felt almost too real. His father's betrayal mirrored the countless times Ethan had felt abandoned by his own industry, the people he once trusted, and the public that had turned their back on him. He could almost feel the sting of those years all over again, the hollow feeling of rejection that he had buried deep inside. Cut. Samantha's voice broke through the haze of his emotions, and Ethan blinked, snapping out of the character. He was breathing heavily, his chest tight, and for a moment, he felt disoriented. The weight of the scene had hit him harder than expected. "That was incredible, Ethan," Samantha said, her voice full of admiration. "You've got a real fire inside you for this role." Ethan gave a small nod, trying to collect himself. The emotional release had been cathartic, but it left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. He had put so much of himself into that scene, and now, he was left trying to regain his footing. He stepped off set, pulling himself together as best he could. He needed a moment to breathe, to process. Later that evening, as Ethan walked back to his apartment, he couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind. The connection between his character and himself had never felt more evident, and the lines between fiction and reality were blurring in ways that both frightened and exhilarated him. But it was also clear to him now, he was facing more than just a career comeback. He was facing his own inner demons, confronting everything that had held him back for so long. The press, the media circus, it was just a part of it all. The real challenge was within him. Could he truly leave the past behind? Could he rise above the noise and build a future that was his, not shaped by others' perceptions? As he entered his apartment and dropped his keys onto the counter, Ethan's mind was racing, but there was a new sense of clarity settling over him. The work was everything. The rest was just noise. It was time to step fully into his own story, no more running, no more hiding. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it didn't feel like a threat. Instead, Ethan grabbed it with renewed purpose. It was a message from Alicia, the producer. "Press tour dates confirmed. Let's talk strategy. You've got this." Ethan smiled, a sense of calm sweeping over him. He was ready for whatever came next. This time, the story would be his to tell. The day had arrived. Ethan could feel the tension building, like a drumbeat in his chest. The press tour was about to begin, and every ounce of his being was telling him to run. But he couldn't. Not this time. He had made the decision, this was his comeback, and he was going to control the narrative, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. He stood in front of the mirror again, this time adjusting his tie. His reflection showed a different man than the one who had stepped onto set weeks ago. The face staring back at him was more confident, more determined. There was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. The phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Alicia, reminding him of the schedule for the day. "Remember, the media's going to try to bait you," Alicia's voice crackled through the speaker. "Stay focused, and don't let them twist your words. Just stick to the script, okay?" Ethan rolled his eyes slightly, though he knew she meant well. "Got it, Alicia. I'll be fine." He hung up, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. The first stop on the press tour was a popular morning show, Rise and Shine. Ethan had been on countless talk shows in the past, but there was something different about this one. Maybe it was the fact that he wasn't just promoting a film anymore, he was trying to redefine his career, his image, and himself in front of millions of viewers. When he arrived at the studio, the team quickly ushered him to the green room, where he was greeted by a smiling host, Claire, who had a reputation for her sharp, no-nonsense interviewing style. "You ready for this, Ethan?" Claire asked, offering him a seat as she adjusted her microphone. Ethan nodded, though his heart was pounding. "As ready as I'll ever be." Claire smiled, sensing his nerves. "I've got to admit, I'm a little excited for this. You're a bit of a mystery these days. The press hasn't been too kind, but I have a feeling you've got a story to tell." Ethan forced a smile. "Well, it's always good to be a little mysterious, right?" As the cameras began to roll, Claire launched into her first question. "Ethan, let's talk about your comeback. We're all familiar with your incredible career, but we also know that you've been through some difficult times. There's been a lot of talk about your personal struggles, and now here you are, making a big return. How do you feel about it? Ethan's stomach tightened. This was the moment. The moment where he would either let the press control the story, or he would take the reins. He took a breath, meeting Claire's gaze. It's been a journey, that's for sure. But I'm here to talk about the work. I'm proud of the film we've made, and I think the audience is going to see something special. As for my personal life, I'd rather leave that to the people who are interested in speculating. What matters is that I'm back, and I'm focused on doing the work I love. Claire raised an eyebrow, impressed by his directness. I like that. But let's not dance around it. The press has been pretty harsh on you. Some say your role in this film is a way to deal with your past. Do you think that's true? Are you using this film as therapy? Ethan paused. This was the trap, the bait. He could feel it, the pressure to respond with something juicy, something that would turn this into a headline. But he wasn't going to fall into it. Not now. I think the role speaks for itself. My character, David, goes through a lot of emotional turmoil, but that doesn't mean it's a reflection of my own life. I'm an actor. I play characters. And this film is a story about redemption, not just for the character, but for everyone involved in making it. It's about looking forward, not backward. Claire seemed satisfied with his answer, and the conversation shifted to the film itself. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line. Every word, every gesture, was being dissected. The rest of the interview went smoothly, but as it wrapped up, Claire leaned in, her expression a little softer now. Ethan, I have to admit, I was expecting more drama. You know, the usual sound bites. But you're keeping it together. That's admirable. I think people are going to respect you for that. Ethan gave her a small smile. Thanks, Claire. I'm just trying to keep it real. After the interview, Ethan felt a strange sense of relief. The first hurdle had been crossed, and he had managed to stay true to himself without letting the press twist his words. But there were many more interviews to come, many more moments where the press would try to drag him into the mud. He knew this was just the beginning. That evening, Alicia called to check in. How'd it go? She asked, her voice full of anticipation. Surprisingly well, Ethan replied. I stuck to the script and didn't give them any drama. They were fishing, but I didn't bite. Alicia chuckled. Good. Keep it up. But remember, this is just the first of many. You've got a lot more interviews lined up, and we're just getting started. Ethan leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes for a moment. He was tired of the cameras, the questions, the media circus. But he knew that he couldn't let it wear him down. This was his chance to prove to the world that he had more to offer than the scandals and the mistakes of the past. The next day, the press tour continued. Interviews, photo ops, and red carpet events, each one a reminder of how far he had come and how far he still had to go. But through it all, Ethan kept his focus. He wasn't going to let the media define him again. He was ready to take control of the story, and nothing was going to stand in his way. As the day wore on, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the conversations he'd had with Samantha, and how much her words had stuck with him. This was more than just a career comeback. It was about reclaiming his life, his image, and his future. And with every interview, every question, he was one step closer to doing just that. The press tour was far from over, but Ethan Blake was ready for whatever came next. The press tour was in full swing, and Ethan had quickly learned that the spotlight was both a gift and a curse. The press, with all its demands and scrutiny, had become a constant companion, following him from one interview to the next. Every word, every smile, every gesture was dissected, analyzed, and often twisted into something more sensational. It was draining, but Ethan remained focused. He had come too far to let the noise get to him. The days blurred together, early mornings spent in makeup chairs, long afternoons answering questions, and evenings walking the red carpet at premieres. Ethan had been on both sides of the media circus before. He'd been the one caught up in scandal, dragged through the mud by the tabloids. This time, though, he was determined to be different. He wasn't going to let them shape his story. He would take control of it himself. But as much as he tried to stay calm, there were moments when the pressure threatened to overwhelm him. The media was relentless, and every positive story was immediately followed by a negative one. Despite his best efforts, the whispers of his past mistakes continued to follow him, just out of sight, like a shadow that refused to go away. One evening, after a long day of interviews, Ethan sat in the back of a car, heading to yet another event. The city lights blurred outside the window as his mind raced. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. He had done everything he could to keep the press at arm's length, but it felt like the walls were closing in. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Alicia. "Ethan, we need to talk. There's something you should know." The text sent a chill down his spine. He immediately called her back. "Alicia, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. "You won't believe this," she said, her tone heavy. "A rumor's starting to spread. And it's not just the usual gossip. It's serious." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What is it? What's going on?" "There's a leak," Alicia said. "Someone from the production crew. They've been talking to the press about your past. Things that you haven't shared publicly. It's starting to gain traction." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. His past, the one he had worked so hard to bury, was being dragged back into the spotlight. The one thing he had been trying to avoid. And now, it was happening. "What exactly are they saying?" Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. "They're digging into your relationship with your father, the one you've been avoiding. They've got some details about the fallout between you two, and they're framing it as the real reason behind your hiatus." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising inside him. His father. The one person who had caused him so much pain, and now, his actions were being used against him once again. "Can we stop it?" Ethan asked, his tone more urgent now. "Can we do something?" "I'm on it," Alicia replied quickly. "I'm talking to PR, and I'll make sure we have a statement ready. But you need to be prepared. The media's going to pounce on this. They're not going to let it go." Ethan leaned back in the seat, his mind reeling. He had worked so hard to get back on track, to keep his focus on the work. And now, it seemed like the past was coming to collect its due. He had to confront it, he couldn't run from it anymore. The next day, the media firestorm exploded. Headlines were everywhere: Ethan Blake's dark past exposed, a family betrayal that almost destroyed him. The articles went into detail about his strained relationship with his father, the years of emotional turmoil, and the impact it had on his personal and professional life. Ethan watched in disbelief as the stories continued to pour in, each one more salacious than the last. His worst fears had come true. The past, which he had kept hidden for so long, was now on full display for the world to see. The press tour was suddenly no longer about the film. It was about Ethan's personal life, his demons, and the scars he had carried with him for years. The questions and interviews shifted from the film to his father, his childhood, the deep wounds that had never healed. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of his privacy, but Ethan knew that there was little he could do to stop it. The media had its teeth in him, and there was no easy way out. As the days passed, the story continued to gain momentum. Ethan did his best to stay calm, to keep his focus on the work, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The more the media dug into his past, the harder it became to ignore the hurt that he had buried for so long. In one of the interviews, the host asked, "Ethan, there's a lot of speculation about your relationship with your father. How do you feel about the public knowing about your past struggles?" Ethan's stomach turned. He wanted to walk out of the interview, to shut it all down. But he couldn't. Not now. He had to face it, even if it meant confronting the deepest part of himself. "I haven't spoken about my father publicly before," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Because it's a painful part of my life. But I guess if it's going to come out, I should at least be the one to share it. My father, he was a complicated man. And the truth is, he hurt me in ways that still affect me today. But that's my story to tell. Not anyone else's." The interview went on, but Ethan felt a sense of release. For the first time, he had spoken openly about the pain he had carried with him. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was the only way forward. The world could know his truth, but they couldn't control it anymore. Later that evening, as Ethan sat alone in his hotel room, the weight of the day's events settled over him. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was taking back control. He had confronted the demons of his past, and he had done it on his terms. As the phone buzzed again, it was Alicia, checking in. "You did good today," she said. "It wasn't easy, but you handled it well." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Thanks. I feel like I just got through the hardest part. It's still not over, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." "You've got this," Alicia assured him. "You're not the same guy you were before. You're stronger now." Ethan looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The world had changed, but so had he. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it head-on. The media storm was showing no signs of slowing down. Headlines continued to churn, and the story of Ethan's troubled past remained the focal point of every conversation. The press had dug in their heels, relentless in their pursuit of every detail. Ethan's father, his upbringing, the years of silence, it was all laid bare for the world to see. Despite the chaos, Ethan had refused to hide. He had embraced the discomfort, speaking openly about his struggles in interviews. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past becoming lighter. But even though he had taken control of the narrative, the emotional toll was far from over. The press tour continued, and Ethan found himself more exhausted with each passing day. The public's insatiable appetite for scandal seemed endless. He spent his nights trying to unwind, only to find himself caught in the endless loop of media coverage. The questions never stopped. How was he really feeling? Was he truly past the pain of his past? Was his father really the villain in his story? It felt like there was no room for him to simply exist outside of the constant scrutiny. His mind would often race as he sat in his hotel rooms, staring out the windows, wondering if he would ever be able to find peace in the chaos. Then came the interview that would change everything. It was a late afternoon when Ethan arrived at the television studio for what was supposed to be a light-hearted chat with a popular talk show host, Jason Montgomery. Ethan had done several interviews with Jason in the past, and their rapport was always easy and relaxed. This time, though, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were different. The last few days had been full of tension, and the media buzz had reached a fever pitch. As the cameras rolled and the audience settled in, Jason welcomed Ethan with a warm smile. "It's great to have you back on the show, Ethan. We've all been watching your press tour, and I have to say, it's been quite the ride." Ethan gave a tight smile, doing his best to appear calm despite the undercurrent of anxiety that gripped him. "Yeah, it's been intense, to say the least." Jason nodded sympathetically. "I can only imagine. I think we've all heard the rumors, seen the headlines, and watched you tackle some tough questions. So, I want to take this moment to really dig into it. You've been very open about your past, especially about your relationship with your father. A lot of people are curious, how did you get to a point where you could talk about it so publicly?" Ethan's stomach twisted. He had expected something along these lines, but it still hit him hard. The past was supposed to be behind him, yet here it was again, clawing its way to the surface. He took a breath. It wasn't easy. For years, I buried everything. I didn't talk about my father, didn't address the hurt. But over time, I realized that keeping it inside wasn't helping anyone, least of all me. The press had already started digging into my past, so I decided it was time for me to share my side of the story. I couldn't keep hiding anymore. Jason leaned forward, his expression more serious now. And how do you feel now, having the world know what happened? The media has been relentless, but it's clear you're trying to move forward. Is it difficult to face all of this in public? Ethan paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The last thing he wanted to do was seem like he was playing the victim. But at the same time, the pain of his past was undeniable. It's not easy, he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I won't lie, there are days when I wish I could just disappear from the headlines. But I can't change what happened. I can't rewrite my story. The only thing I can do now is face it head on and hope that I can come out the other side stronger. Jason nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. It's clear that you've been through a lot. And I think people respect the fact that you're trying to be honest about it. But, Ethan, do you think this story ever really ends? I mean, your past is always going to be part of who you are, right? The question struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. Could he ever truly escape the shadows of his past? Was he doomed to forever be tied to his father's mistakes, to the mistakes he had made in his own life? The weight of it all threatened to suffocate him. He swallowed hard. I don't know. Maybe it never really goes away. But I think that's part of the healing process, accepting that the past will always be there in some form, and learning how to live with it. I can't change it, but I can choose how I move forward. Jason's eyes softened, and he smiled. I think that's something a lot of people will relate to. You're showing them that even when life knocks you down, you can keep going. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that. He was telling the truth, and the world was hearing it. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point. Maybe it wouldn't always be like this, maybe, eventually, the press would move on. After the interview ended, Ethan felt a sense of relief, but also something else, uncertainty. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had just made a breakthrough, or if he had opened a wound that would never heal. The press continued to dig, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't just being swept along by the tide. He was making the choices now. He was deciding how much of himself to give away and how much to keep hidden. That evening, as he sat in his hotel room, the familiar loneliness settled in. The quiet was almost unbearable. He picked up his phone and texted Alicia, I think I'm finally ready to be done with this. It was time for him to stop living in the shadow of his past. He had confronted it. He had shared his truth with the world. And now, it was time to focus on what came next. Ethan woke up to the soft morning light filtering through the blinds of his hotel room. It had been a few days since his last interview, and though the media frenzy still hadn't died down, something felt different. The storm had passed. The press had done their job, dissecting every part of his life, but now they seemed to be looking elsewhere for their next story. Ethan had survived, and for the first time in a long while, he could take a breath. He leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was still buzzing from the whirlwind of the past few weeks, the interviews, the confrontations, and the constant flood of emotions. But now, the silence was a relief. It felt like an opportunity to breathe, to take control of his own life again. No more hiding. No more running from the past. But there was one thing left to do. The morning passed in a blur of phone calls and meetings. The press was starting to lose interest, and for Ethan, that was a small victory. He had expected things to calm down after his interviews, but he hadn't expected it to happen this quickly. It was almost as if the world had already moved on. He had become just another headline in a sea of celebrity gossip. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he was moving on too. Slowly but surely, Ethan had come to realize that this wasn't just about the press or the fame. It was about him. It was about his future and the life he was ready to build for himself. In the afternoon, he received a call from Alicia. She had been his lifeline through this whole ordeal, and he had no doubt that without her, he might have crumbled under the weight of it all. "Hey, how are you feeling?" Alicia's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm good," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Actually, I think I'm finally okay. I've been thinking a lot about what comes next." "That's good to hear," Alicia replied, a touch of relief in her tone. "I've been following up with the press, and it seems like they're starting to ease up. The story's getting old for them, and they're moving on to something else." Ethan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "I guess I'm not the only one tired of hearing about me." Alicia chuckled. "It's been a long ride, but you're almost there. The hard part is over." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He hadn't realized until that very moment how much he had been holding on to the past. All the anger, the pain, the disappointment, it had been suffocating him. But now, it felt like the weight had lifted. He could finally breathe again, and it felt like freedom. "You know, Alicia," he began, his voice softer now, "I think I'm ready to let go of all of it. The anger, the hurt, the shame. It's not mine to carry anymore." Alicia paused before speaking. "That's big, Ethan. I'm proud of you." He could feel the sincerity in her words, and it made him feel a little lighter. "Thanks. I couldn't have done it without you." "I'll always be here for you," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Now, what's next for you? What do you want?" Ethan thought about the question for a moment. He had been so focused on the past for so long that he hadn't really stopped to think about the future. But now, the possibilities were endless. He had spent years avoiding his truth, but now that he had confronted it, he realized that he had the freedom to build something new. Something that didn't rely on the mistakes of his past. "I want to keep acting," Ethan said, a sense of purpose flooding him. "But I also want to take control of the roles I choose. I want to be in stories that matter, stories that challenge me. I want to work with people who care about the craft, not the drama." Alicia's voice was full of encouragement. "I know you can do it. You've got the talent. And now, you've got the strength to back it up. Whatever you decide, I'm behind you 100%. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. In that moment, he realized that he didn't need to prove anything to the world. He had nothing left to prove. What mattered now was that he could live authentically, on his terms. The weeks that followed were full of new beginnings. Ethan signed onto a film project that was different from anything he had done before. It was a role that challenged him, both emotionally and creatively. It wasn't the kind of film that would make headlines or dominate the box office, but it was a story that he believed in. And that was all that mattered. The paparazzi still followed him. The tabloids still wrote their stories, but it didn't affect him the way it used to. Ethan had learned to ignore the noise, to focus on what mattered most, his craft, his relationships, and his personal growth. He was building a new life, one step at a time. One evening, after a long day of shooting, Ethan sat in his trailer, watching the sunset through the window. His phone buzzed with a message from Alicia. "You're doing it, Ethan," the text read. "You're creating the life you deserve." Ethan smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. The journey had been long, and there had been moments where he felt like he would never escape the shadows of his past. But now, he was walking into the light. And he knew, without a doubt, that the future was his to shape. As the credits rolled on his next film, Ethan sat in the theater, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had supported him along the way. He had come full circle, he was no longer defined by his past, and for the first time in his life, he was truly free. The story of his rise, fall, and redemption had been written. And as he stood up to join the applause, Ethan knew that the best was yet to come. The journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?